one of the things I think is really important when you're talking about leaders as role models, it's actually about the decisions that they're making about the systems as well. So part of developing leaders as role models is them looking at their own behaviour and how they interact with others. But part of it is about how they use their time. Part of it is how they use their money. Part of it is about how they actually set up all of those systems inside the organisation, which kind of comes back to the previous question, which is, do you have to start at the top? Well, the problem is actually eventually, if you don't go senior enough in the organisation and the same decisions keep getting made around the broader systems, you actually can get a lot of behavioural change, but it won't stick because the systems kind of will ultimately.
And we speak about the shadow of the leader, right? The behavior symbols and system that we talk about, they apply to the whole organization, but they also apply to individuals. So leading culture as an individual leader, it's about managing my shadow. It's about being clear on the behaviors I'm role modeling. Are they the right ones or not? But it's also about the decisions that I'm making personally and the symbols that I'm using. And it's about evaluating the messages they're sending and how those messages are received. Are they the right messages? Are they what I want people to perceive? And if it is, great. If it is not, I need to adjust it. And that's my leadership of culture.
So let's delve into that a bit more, because Jocelyn, who's with SocGen, has asked us a question up front about that gauging the impact of the role modeling. So how do you measure? How do you get the feedback on role modeling? She's also added another question that's come in on the screen, which is how do you then, I suppose, spread or look at the spread of the different leaders across geographies and across, into getting into operating companies in countries where you may not want to take on the pure role modeling of the leader who's in a different culture in a different part of the world. So maybe let's start with that sort of, how do you get the feedback? How do you measure the role modeling first? And then if you want to add that to help Jocelyn, that'd be great.
So how about I did the first one? You tackle national cultures. So in terms of the measuring, there's actually two things we observe happen that should happen in terms of measuring. One, we like using a form of 360 to get a baseline, so people can actually get some objective data about how they are perceived and how people observe them behaving, but also then they can retest that and they can see how they have shifted. And we find that is very motivating and useful for people to kind of get a sense of where they're going. The reality though is that a lot of the feedback comes back anecdotally as well. So it becomes feedback from the team, it becomes the engagement of the team, they start the business results of the team, as well as then the conversations that people are starting to have. So the energy around culture, for example, so when people start going, actually we need to do more of this, we need to invest more time, that is a fantastic feedback mechanism as well. So I think we've got both of those work. Do you want to pick up?
I mean, there's two things I want to say, and they're two very big things. They're really big question. The first element Amanda is touching on is the team aspect. So culture change really happens in the team, intact teams, and what happens in intact team is magical. So yes, I'm getting feedback as an individual leaders, and I'm working on myself, but how does that play out and where does that play out? The first sort of, if you want, area or domain where it plays out is with my intact team, with the people that either report to me or my colleagues or my peers. And using all that data and all that knowledge and working together as the team is how you start actually spreading the word and getting it beyond me as an individual leader. So the more work you'll do with the teams, that's what happens. So if you want, work with the individuals and then work with the teams and work with teams across the teams. And you start replicating, if you want, the behavioral and the mindset change. So that's the first element I wanted to talk about, the importance of team in culture change. It's key. And it's a little bit different from what we used to do and what we do sometimes on leadership development that tends to focus very much on the individual. With culture change, because it's about patterns, this is actually what happens between individuals as well. The second thing, and that was in relation to multinational organizations, international, it will be different. And where the difference takes place is in the implementation. So let's say that, for example, you want to have a speaking up program in the organization where you have realized that we need to be more open. We need to treat failures as a learning opportunity. Well, the way it's going to be expressed in France or in the US may be different from the way it's going to be expressed in Indonesia or in China. So what we suggest organizations do is be very clear across the board around the kind of mindsets and the large behaviors we want to see to have a certain impact in the organization, but then empower your divisions or empower your countries and your teams to actually translate it into what this means for us. So for example, in Asia, speaking up, we know there's the not losing face element of the culture. So the teams then again, in for example, in Indonesia, will work around, okay, so what does speaking up mean for us? What does it mean? How can we be open? So you're working on the same topic, but you implement it slightly differently.
I think one of the things that's interesting on the national cultures front, though, is we've done a lot of work with global organisations, and we do assessments across those organisations. And there is an underlying perception that actually we're all very, very different. And time again, we find the same cultural traits that run as a red thread throughout the organisation, kind of irrespective where people are in the world. And I think it's often a surprise, but it's a case of, you know, because we talk about the importance of systems, you've got, you know, the senior leadership driving decisions, some of those behaviours are then conveyed through leadership programs, through people moving globally. You actually find that often the common causes that sit underneath the target culture and what you're trying to create are the same. But, you know, as Jerome said, you have to often then, what you want to change, you might need to adjust to the local national culture. But I think it's important to understand actually the company culture can transcend the national cultures.
And very often the values may be identical, but the behaviors that are translated from those values may differ a little bit. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
And hopefully that answers your question, Farhan, as well, about working in multiple locations across multiple parts of the world. These guys have been working on a project. I think it was 27 countries that you've been covering. So some really strong recent experience there. Perhaps we can move to one of the questions that keeps coming up is the whole. We've sort of touched on it a little bit. This resistance to change. What happens when you've got a leader or leaders who are resistant to change or just can't see the point? So thanks, Orkan, for this one. From Orkan from Softtech. Amanda, what happens when you come up against, either you personally come up against resistance, or you know that the team you're working with is finding there's a resistance to change?
So first thing to say is it's completely normal. It's quite common that at the beginning of a culture change effort that there will be people within the leadership team, the executive team, that aren't bought in that this is absolutely critical, this is important, a useful diversion of resources and energy. There are a couple of things that we find make a huge difference when you've got resistance. One is there will always be people that are pro this and for this. So you need to find them, and then you need to use them as your advocates. That's one important thing. The other thing that we find works fairly consistently is connecting culture to business outcomes. So one of the mistakes we think often happens with culture is it becomes a nice thing to do. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about it as something that's quite isolated from inside the organization, whereas the reality is culture is critical to your business outcomes. So if you can get the executive to make that intellectual connection between culture and outcomes, you often find some of the resistance falls away. So that's up front. It's a different matter when you're actually trying to change the behaviours of leaders and they're resisting that.
There's two elements that I would add to what Amanda has said. So the link to the why is so important. The second element is that I'll bring it back to the focus that I was talking about before. So yes, it is about changing myself a little bit, and change is always scary. So some people and some of the leaders in particular will resist to change. But what we find is that by bringing some focus on what needs to change, it's a lot less threatening. So it's not about changing the whole person you are. It's actually in terms of speaking up, making sure that you ask more questions, or maybe you share some of your failures. So defining 2 or 3 behaviors and one mindset that sits behind it, that's all we need to shift. So we find that leaders are much more receptive and not as resistant, because not only can they see the impact on the business, but it's actually a small part of me. So, okay, I'm happy to change that because it doesn't change the person I am beyond that. And the second element that I wanted to talk about, once again, is bringing it back to the team. So the team is a very healthy support for change. So if I, as a leader within a team, I'm resisting a little bit, by using the team that wants to change and by sharing and working in a safe environment that is the team, then people become less resistant to change.
Right. There's a question that's I'm seeing on the screen there from Farhan again. Thank you, Farhan. And it sort of perhaps fits with this whole challenge of resistance. But you know, do you need to bring in an external advisor like Walking the Talk to help with culture change generally? And if so, are there other points at which it's helpful for an internal team to have external help, maybe around resistance, maybe around process? But you know, what are your thoughts on why are you needed?
I'll start, and maybe you can build. The first thing of course, I mean, we are needed, right? So we believe that having some external help is needed, and maybe I'll let Amanda also talk about the championing too. But one thing that by being external you bring, so whether you're external to the division or external to the organization, is the ability to see what everybody's not seeing anymore. So what, you know, mindsets and behaviors is the way we do things around here. So we stop seeing it because that's natural. That's the way we do things. So if you don't have somebody external that can actually really challenge those things, what we find is that it's very difficult. And that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to add when we start working with leaders is that you have to be vulnerable when you want to change as a leader. You have to be quite open. And it is sometimes a bit difficult to be totally open and vulnerable internally when you don't have the process, the systems, and the culture in place to support that. So sometimes having somebody external to come and help and kickstart that process is very helpful, I find. What do you think?
I mean, we spend a lot of our time skilling up internal teams on what they can do, particularly to embed and to reinforce inside the day-to-day the change. So our view is that we cannot come into an organization and create the change. It must come from within. But there are certain skills that are needed internally to kind of enable that. Part of that is the ability to recognize the new behaviors, because again, if you, exactly as Jerome was saying, if you live and breathe it day to day, you're immune to it and you can't recognize it. And because it's within your comfort zone, it's quite hard to challenge. And then the other part is actually, how do you observe and how do you give feedback in a way that people aren't going to resist it inside the organization? So what we find is that it's very useful for us to kind of perhaps provide the news back, hold the mirror up to the organization, hold the mirror up to the individuals in terms of how they, you know, how they're operating, you know, that brutal reality of what they're doing. But actually then the hard grind where the real behavioral change happens inside the day-to-day is where the internal teams, you know, tag teaming with us do an absolutely critical job to create that change on the ground inside the day-to-day, the ongoing feedback, keeping it conscious, helping people connect the dots between what they're doing and the impact it's having. That's where the real change happens in the longer term. And that's a skill that you have inside your organization.
One thing I like to say is that the difficulty with culture change, or the ultimate paradigm, is that you're trying to create a new culture from the current culture. So you've got to work within the current culture to develop your target culture. And that's very, very difficult, right? So this is where sometimes the external help helps.
So Farhan, hope that gives you a good answer. I mean, I definitely, when I experienced this, the sense of helping set the direction, helping hands to get you over the line and get you moving, and then also just that sense of perspective that Jerome mentioned, in terms of both where you're going, and then the one I want to come on to now is sort of telling the story, and the story of the culture, both at the sort of the macro level, and at the more, how do you make it work at the individual level? And actually, there's a great question coming from Kerry Freeman. So, is it important that the whole organization needs to know your cultural destination? So she's saying she's got something defined, but it's rather limited to the top of house. So is it important that everybody understands where you're going? So let's start at the macro level, and then maybe come back some tips on storytelling and how you really build the culture story. Amanda.
Look, I think it's an interesting one, because, our company's called Walking the Talk, and I have seen a lot of culture efforts fail by organisations going out with a big campaign with the kind of lanyards and the mouse pads and the posters and the communications about this is who we're going to be as a culture, and then the day-to-day reality that everybody experiences for a really long time is nothing linked to that. So I think it is one to be really careful about, and usually my advice to organisations is it's about having a really careful plan of perhaps making sure people kind of have a sense of what you're trying to achieve, aligned with some clear activity and demonstration of how that becomes a reality. There's got to be some link to authenticity. There's got to be some action that backs up what you're trying to do, so it doesn't just seem like hollow words, would be the key thing. And so, for example, one of the things that we've done is where you've got a leadership team who are not demonstrating the behaviours yet, they've got some way to go. We've gone in and found role models in the organisation. So we've helped find people who already demonstrate the kind of culture the organisation is trying to achieve, and they're matched the culture story with people in the organisation who are already doing it, to give it some sense of, actually, this is possible, this is believable, this is doable in our organisation. So you've got to give that sense of hope, and this can be done. So I think there comes a point where, yes, you do need to get it out there, because actually you need to set the intention, but how you do it, you need to just think about the timing and pacing of that. Can you do,
I mean, in a way, it's sort of implied in her question is there a guerrilla movement? Is there a way that you can do this by just changing the way the leadership, the culture of the leadership, so it percolates down? Or do you have to have that sort of all-embracing story where hopefully not the mouse mats, but where the leadership communication, the real understanding through the whole organisation of where your journey is headed?
So we believe you need a narrative that kind of sits at the heart of the culture change that you're trying to create, and then there needs to be a really careful communication strategy linked to that, and linked to clear behaviours. One of the key things we work with leaders on is two things. One is amplification of what they're doing, so people can observe it, because one of the things that happens is leaders are doing great things but nobody knows about them.
Absolutely.
And the other one is connecting the dots. So I am doing this because, and so having leaders work on amplification and connecting the dots, and then having this narrative that has kind of a clear plan that maps with your role models, with the leaders, with the other system things that you're doing, so it can be really powerful in terms of reality and rhetoric.
Right,
keep those two aligned.
So Jerome, bring that to life for us. Tell us some stories about when it's gone wonderfully, and maybe at the individual level, and give us one example of where it's gone horribly wrong, perhaps.
Well, I just want to mention the very first example that I talked about. So this organization had a new CEO coming in, and it was a he changed the culture without meaning to, or maybe he meant to, but unconsciously. So he brought a lot of achievement, a lot of results focused, and accountability. People in that, he made an assessment when he started that accountability was not high enough. Profits were going down. That was part of the problem. That was his assessment. So what he did, because it also fits with his personality, he worked on that. So he role modeled accountability. He made sure that the delegation authorities were in place, that people knew what they had to do. So all the right things to increase accountability and achievement. And it worked.
Mm-hmm.
So he did change the culture of that organization without talking about it. But he was role modeling the right thing, putting pressure on his teams directly behind him. He had changed the systems and was using symbols very smart without knowing that he was doing that. So it can happen. However, where I am with Amanda is if you want it to happen faster in a more sustainable way, bringing people with you on the journey can really help. And in particular, when you start wanting to work with the levels down of leadership, if you're not very clear on what your goalpost is and what the end goal is, what we're walking towards, even if that goalpost is constantly moving because culture changes all the time, it's just going to take longer and you may actually fail a bit more often.
So I'm looking at another question that sort of perhaps builds on that, again from Farhan, thank you. When you're looking at a goal and you're talking about a culture change program in a large organization, how long should the leaders be looking at working on this? Are we talking 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years in order to see real change happen?
I'll start by saying that the first thing is you need to constantly work on it. So one of the mistakes that some of our clients do, they see change starting to happen sometimes after 6 months, because if you're super focused on one thing and you're working on your symbols, your behaviors and your process, you can actually get a lot of changes happening within 6 months' time. If you're changing the delegation authority and you started to empower people, you will get some changes quickly. However, the mistake they're making is that they're just giving up, or not giving up, they stop focusing and putting some pressure on it because they think it's done. Yeah. We're being successful. What usually happens is people revert back to type and the culture changes back to what it was before because it hasn't reached a sustainable level. So you need enough time for that to happen, right? And I say if you want to focus on one thing and you're doing really well, after 1 year, you'll definitely see a lot of changes, and after 2 years, it'll be embedded. What's your view?
I completely agree. Yeah. And I think, but the key comes back again to the focus. So the amount of time something takes to create a change is about how much focus you have. So if you focus on 6 things, actually probably not going to move very far in 12 months. If you've got 1 or 2 critical things that you're trying to shift, you could definitely see a big impact.
2 examples. One of our clients worked on 3 things they wanted to change, which was increase collaboration, increase trust in the organization, and work on their customer centricity. They worked on it for 3 years, and they managed to improve customer centricity, the trust as well up to a certain level, but certainly not the collaboration. And it took them a long time, right? And it wasn't very, very fast. Whereas we're working with another client, and after 1 year, they've massively increased customer centricity and in a sustainable way. And all the measures we're getting is that it's really there and the mindsets have changed.
And very similarly, we've got another client that's working on one team, effectively, achievement, becoming much more outcome focused and customer centricity. And we've deliberately made a focus on the one team, which they've shifted. They're now moving on to the achievement, which is their next thing. And both of those are critical underpinnings for the customer centricity to really flourish. But we're tackling them one by one. And they're seeing then the tangible shift. And then we're moving on to the next one to really hone in and focus around. So that focus makes a huge difference.
Right.
Change.
We're coming up very close to time. We did say 45 minutes. So we've got about a minute left from when we started in terms of being a minute in. We've got a couple more questions have just come up. I think we'll take 1 or 2, and then I'll ask Amanda and Jerome if they want to sum up before we close. So we've had a couple around CEOs, so let's talk those through. There's one from Zaga, hope I pronounced that right, and then another one from Kim Lee. The one from Kim Lee was about so what happens if you've got a CEO who's resistant or is not stepping up or taking on the responsibility around culture, perhaps because they don't value it. Do you just have to say, well, this doesn't fit the business plan or our short-term objectives and back off? Or is there a way to help the leadership team or the people team to really get the CEO to shift their perspective? And then the one from Zega is more around what happens when you have a new CEO, and that can lead to a huge flux in the people around them and the wider team.
Can I take the first one very
Please
briefly?
do.
I'll be quick. Something we did with one of our clients again. It was difficult for the top team to be really behind the whole thing. An exercise we did, we had to identify the patterns that were problematic or creating a little bit of an issue within the organization. What we did, we sat down and we said, so how many millions of dollars is this costing the organization, or what are the potential opportunities that we're missing out in terms of hundreds of millions of dollars? We did that with the top team. We did a calculation, and they knew actually how to do it. It didn't take very long, and it was hundreds of millions of dollars. Let me tell you, after we did that exercise, they were sold on it. The other second thing that we've done elsewhere, it's once again used the team. And when one person, the particular CEO that I'm thinking of, is a little bit resistant or not coming on the journey, we're doing it with the team. So not in isolation. Right. And you've got to give them a little bit of time because sometimes it takes some people more time. But be at it and don't give up.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, so I would agree that the business link usually is the critical way in. You know, we've had a really interesting scenario with one of our clients we're working with where the CEO is leaving in 12 months' time. So isn't therefore vested in the longer term interest, but the team below who are inheriting the company have to then live with the culture. So actually what we've done is that CEO isn't resistant. He's happy to go along with it, but he's not personally going to invest a lot of his time. But actually we're doing a lot with that team, and they're really driven and motivated because they know that this is critical for the long-term success. So I think if the CEO isn't obstructing what you're doing, I think you can actually still do an awful lot, even if they're not hugely on board.
I agree.
And so I suppose the second question in terms of, you know, a new CEO coming in and in terms of how do you get them to buy into culture, we had a really interesting example actually with one of our clients in that just as we were finishing our culture assessment, a brand new CEO walked in, and the story goes that he had spent 4 days out in the business, orientating himself, going to different offices, talking to people. And on the 5th day, it sounds a little biblical, but on the 5th day, we presented our report, which actually articulated exactly what he had experienced in those first 4 days. So I think having good data is a great way to engage your CEO. What exactly is happening in the organization and what exactly is the impact that has on the outcomes? Because for this particular CEO, went on to make a very significant investment in culture because he said, actually, do you know what? This is exactly what I've experienced, and exactly, you've just clarified in a few pages exactly what we need to do to shift our business for long-term success. So
interesting. So never underestimate a leadership's team to evaluate risk and understand where the dollar impact can be, or the pound or the euro impact can be, or a CEO's ability to see opportunity and to really get the most out of an opportunity, including culture. We better sum up because we've had some great questions. We've run over time. Thank you very much for your input, everyone out there in the big wide world. Amanda, Jerome, is there anything you'd like to say just to sum up before we close?
So I think that the couple of things I'd like to just reinforce. One is, you know, working with leaders on beliefs is really the key to unlocking things, and never underestimate the value of connecting the dots between their own behaviour, the behaviour of the team, and the business outcomes in terms of getting them engaged in terms of culture.
So you stole my thunder, right?
Oh, sorry.
I would say leading culture is about being strategic. So we're talking about strategy. So being extremely clear and conscious of what you need to do. Absolutely working on the beliefs. This is key. So identifying those beliefs is the other element I would just add.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us.